I'm Nima Rajan. 14 beams of light will be projected into the sky from Mount Royal tonight. This is to honor the lives of 14 women shot and killed 32 years ago today at Montreal's Ecole Polytechnique. Federal party leaders issued statements to mark the National Day of Remembrance and Action on Violence Against Women. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau is asking everyone to reflect on what we can do through words and actions to end gender-based violence. Conservative leader Erin O'Toole is urging Canadians to denounce unacceptable behavior, teach children and loved ones to respect one another, and set an example. While NDP leader Jagmeet Singh says we must put a stop to men's violence against women, particularly Indigenous women, racialized women, trans women, low-income women, and disabled women. All right, well, meanwhile, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says he is accepting the resignation of Dominic Barton as Canada's ambassador to China with both gratitude and respect. Mr. Barton will step down at the end of the month. This comes after 2 years in which he was praised for helping secure the release of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, but criticized for strongly pushing closer ties with Beijing. New legislation is expected to be announced in Parliament today that would remove mandatory minimum penalties for drug offenses. The Liberals tabled a bill back in February that would have allowed for greater use of conditional sentences and counseling or treatment, but it didn't pass before the federal election was called. With just 2 weeks to go before the holiday break, the Liberals also want to get their new pandemic aid bill through Parliament. But the Conservatives want it split in two, so MPs can vote separately on supports for businesses and workers. Ottawa is set to display a bit of political give and take. The federal government is planning to introduce a new pandemic aid package, but in order to ensure its speedy passage through the House of Commons, the Liberals agreed to let the Finance Committee grill Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland about the economy, the latest aid package, and the government's pandemic response overall. The Canadian military has discovered cracks in the tails of 19 of its 23 Cyclone helicopters. The Royal Canadian Air Force issued an emailed statement yesterday. It said cracks had been detected in one Sikorsky-built helicopter in BC on November 26th, and a fleet-wide inspection was started. The RCAF says the aircraft have not been grounded, and engineers from the military are working with the company to repair them. The entire fleet is overseen by 12 Wing Shearwater, which is the RCAF base in the Halifax area. Crown Indigenous Relations Minister Mark Miller says the government will turn over some residential school records to the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation within 30 days. In October, the Winnipeg-based centre refuted a statement by the Prime Minister that the federal government had turned over all the records in its possession. Mr. Miller says the government now believes its obligation to residential school survivors takes precedence over obligations it had to entities of the Catholic Church. Phil Fontaine, a former national chief of the Assembly of First Nations, says he believes it is the right time, with the right pope, for the Catholic Church to take the step toward reconciliation. Later this month, Mr. Fontaine will make his second trip to the Vatican to ask a pope to apologize for the Catholic Church's role in residential schools. In 2009, Mr. Fontaine was part of an Indigenous delegation that met with former Pope Benedict. The pontiff then expressed his sorrow and personal anguish over residential schools, but he never apologized. The Trans Mountain Pipeline has restarted following a 3-week precautionary shutdown during a series of storms that battered BC. The Federal Crown Corporation says the pipeline was safely restarted yesterday after all necessary assessments and repairs were completed. It says some of that work included the construction of protective earthworks. This comes after flooding exposed sections of the pipeline, which carries 300,000 barrels per day of petroleum products from Alberta to BC. Trans Mountain says it is monitoring the pipeline on the ground, by air, and through its control center after the restart. Well, today marks the 104th anniversary of the Halifax explosion. The explosion occurred on December 6, 1917, after the French munitions ship Mont Blanc and the Norwegian relief ship IMO collided in the narrows of Halifax Harbor. More than 2,000 people were killed and another 9,000 were injured. Almost all of the city's north end was destroyed, and buildings throughout Halifax and Dartmouth were significantly damaged. All right, we'll be back after the break with a look at a report arguing for a new approach to national security as Canada faces a new set of threats. We'll have an interview with Dr. Wesley Wark, Senior Fellow with the Centre for International Governance Innovation, up next. So stay with us. We'll be right back after a short break. The Canadian government is being urged to rethink its approach to national security. The Centre for International Governance Innovation released a report titled Reimagining a Canadian National Security Strategy. Drawing upon 250 experts, the special report says that Canada needs to do more to meet the challenges of today's world. These include the pandemic, rising geopolitical tensions, climate change security impacts, changes in technology, and economic security concerns. It recommends significant governance reforms, arguing that the current status quo is not enough. And with us to unpack the report is one of the authors, Dr. Wesley Wark, Senior Fellow at the Centre for International Governance and Innovation. Doctor, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thanks for having me on your program.
So let's start with what led you and your colleagues at CIGI to undertake this report in the first place.
Well, there was a couple of things, really. One was just a reflection on the fact that the last time that Canada produced a national security strategy, what was called the National Security Policy Statement, was way back in 2004. And that policy, as interesting as it was in its time, is completely outdated and irrelevant to today's circumstances. So that was part of it. You know, frankly, the other big driver was the experience of COVID-19 and a realization that I think was slow to come to the Canadian government that pandemics do in fact pose national security challenges, and our national security and intelligence community wasn't ready to assist the government in understanding the threat posed by COVID-19 when it emerged in China and thinking about a globalized response. So, those were the two considerations. Really, the feeling was that it was time for us to appreciate that the national security threat environment has been radically transformed. There are all kinds of new challenges to Canadian national security that we need to think about. We need a different kind of dialogue with Canadians about them, we thought, and we believed that there really was a window of opportunity here. As Winston Churchill says, we quote in the report, a crisis is too good a thing to waste. Well, we're in a terrible crisis. We don't want to waste this moment by forgetting what we should be learning about the changing nature of national security challenges for Canada.
All right, sir. Well, it's interesting that your report mentions that defining the issue of national security is not easy in itself. So what type of definition do you use in your report?
Well, we wanted to have, we were looking for a golden mean, to be honest, to somewhere between as much precision as possible and something that would be all-encompassing. We recognize that national security means many things to many people, and it's a portmanteau phrase, as is often described. But the essence of it for us is really an understanding of how national security impacts on a society. And the fact that, front and center for national security is not just the protection of a government or the defense of borders, it's really a protection of Canadians. So built into our definition of national security is really a defense of democracy as we understand it, and democratic institutions and practices. So that is something we wanted to sort of put the forefront, because I think many people really misunderstand. It's not surprising because we don't talk about it enough, but don't really understand what national security is all about. It's really about protecting all of us.
All right, Doctor, just a little over a minute and a half left here, but we mentioned the 5 global threats you identified in this report. Can you go over them and unpack them for our viewers?
Well, what we wanted to call attention to was the fact that the national security threat environment has changed. We are facing a set of security challenges, the likes of which we've never seen before. And many of these challenges don't come at us from traditional threat actors. Some of them do, but nation states are not our only concern. So we identified 5 main threats, including pandemics, current ones and future ones, climate change security impacts, which is going to be a big preoccupation, I think, on the national security front in the years to come. We paid attention to technological change and its implications. We wanted to look at economic security, which is really going to transform the way in which I think governments need to fashion economic policy. And our old notion, essentially, of laissez-faire economies is not going to work in the current global economy. And then finally, we looked at geopolitical competition. Interestingly, back in 2004, when the last national security strategy was produced, there was no mention of geopolitical competition because it wasn't a thing then. Nowadays, Canada is facing a very fractured international system with a rising China, an uncertain US ally, all kinds of changes around the world. And so, that's part of the reimagining that has to take place.
All right, Dr. Wark, thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily News.
Thanks so much for the opportunity.
We'll be right back after the break with more news from around the world. But first, a chemistry professor at McGill University went public after being refused a grant over a lack of diversity. We'll have more on his story up next, so stay with us. We'll be back after a short break. A McGill University professor says he has been denied 2 federal government grants for his research on the grounds of lack of diversity. Award-winning scientist Patanjali Kampambati claims he was refused for the latest grant because he maintained his position in hiring research assistants who he believed are qualified regardless of their identity. In the most recent grant application, he was asked about inclusion and diversity considerations around his hiring of staff, to which he replied, quote, "We will hire the most qualified people based upon their skills and mutual interests." Professor Kampambati says basing hiring decisions on merit itself is a valid and moral position to stand on. And joining us now to tell us more on his story is Professor Patanjali Kampambati himself. Sir, welcome to Forum Daily.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, it's interesting that you didn't go public after the rejection of your first grant based on similar grounds. So why did you decide to report this issue after the second grant application?
Well, it's a joke among scientists that 2 data points makes a line, but every 2 data points makes a line. So the first one, I got rejected. I thought, oh no, what could this be? I shared it with some of my colleagues. Jordan Peterson wrote a story about it for the National Post in which I was anonymous. For the second data point, I thought, what's going to happen here? This is quite problematic. This is quite troubling. And I wanted to come forward. And I didn't know what to do, but a newspaper reporter from the National Post somehow got wind of it. He asked me some questions. And as a scientist, I'm compelled to honesty first and foremost. So I told him what honestly happened to me. And that became the story. But I hadn't really thought what I was going to do with the second rejection. And to be fair, it wasn't an outright rejection. The first one was an outright rejection. The second one was they were telling me they will not look at me or my proposal more specifically because I failed on the EDI requirements. If I rewrite the EDI, then they might look at me again, my proposal again. So it's not fully dead yet. But the point of the story is, in the last 1 year, I've had my last 2 federal grant applications be vetted based upon EDI as opposed to science, and that's never happened in probably 100 years of the West.
All right, sir. Well, we quoted you on your answer to the diversity question. Tell us a little bit more about what you meant by your answer.
Well, that's the funny thing, is that I wrote what I thought was a very nice and inclusive answer. I was asked to be inclusive. I've been inclusive. I've been excluded my whole life due to racism. And I tried to use that to be inclusive of other people, regardless of race or gender or ethnicity or nationality or religion. So what I said is, regardless of who you are, I'm going to welcome you into my lab. All you have to do is want to do the work. That's it. And somehow the point is forgotten that you have to want to do the work. This is not kindergarten here. This is science. This is the Green Berets. We're supposed to be discovering how nature works, and it's very, very hard. You have to want to be here. And if you want to be here, it'll be my pleasure to mentor you and guide you to scientific success. That's what I was trying to say.
All right, Dr. K. Well, a little over a minute and a half left here, but tell us a little bit more about your research and why you are applying for these grants.
Well, I, and like all scientists, we live off federal funding that pays for us to exist. And I build lasers and optical clocks to study the motion of electrons in materials like solar cells and flat panel displays and lighting and all these other things like that. But I've raised $7 million in the last 15 years. All of that was based upon scientific merit. Only in the last 1 year has it been based upon EDI as opposed to scientific merit or in parallel with scientific merit. And that's a very big change in the last 1 year.
All right. Well, meanwhile, you mentioned that you had your own personal experiences with racism yourself. Would you be able to share with our viewers?
Well, it's honestly so much I can't even remember. I mean, as a kid, I grew up in Minnesota in the 1970s, and I was able to play the role of every possible race you could imagine for dealing with sort of epithets and, physical interactions and, fairly dramatic things, but I don't want to belabor that point. And the same thing has also happened, I think, as an adult in the US and Canada, because I can be targeted and I have been targeted, but I don't view that as an opportunity for me to exclude other people or to view myself as a victim. I'm here to try to include all people. And that happens by, as Martin Luther King said, by treating people as individuals.
All right, Dr. K, thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily.
Thank you.
All right, we will be back after the break with a look at stories from around the world. The Biden administration is staging a diplomatic boycott of the Winter Olympics. The WHO is reporting a spike in malaria deaths, and Myanmar's former leader has been sentenced to prison. These stories and more when we return from break, so stay with us. The White House says the United States will stage a diplomatic boycott of the 2022 Winter Olympics in Beijing. This is in protest of China's record on human rights. That would mean American athletes would compete, but no American government officials would attend. China is firing back, saying the Olympics are, quote, not a stage for political shows and political manipulation, and calling diplomatic boycotts completely selfish and sensational. Well, moving to Indonesia, where rescuers on Monday retrieved more bodies buried under volcanic debris after an eruption on Java Island. The explosion killed at least 22 people and left 27 others missing. Mount Semeru erupted on Saturday, triggered by heavy rain. Villages and nearby towns were blanketed by tons of volcanic debris. Disaster officials say 56 people were hospitalized. Well, there were 241 million cases of malaria worldwide last year, which is up 14 million from 2019. The World Health Organization says the COVID-19 pandemic disrupted health services in many countries, leading to tens of thousands more deaths worldwide. While the number of malaria deaths climbed 69,000, the UN Health Agency had expected the situation to be much worse. It is crediting the work of many countries that ramped up their programs to fight malaria. A Nigerian official has criticized a travel ban imposed on the West African nation by the British government as punitive, indefensible, and discriminatory. UK Health Secretary Sajid Javid said added Nigeria to the UK's travel red list on Saturday. It means that arrivals from there would be banned except for UK and Irish residents. He said there was a significant number of Omicron cases linked to travel with Nigeria, with 27 cases recorded in England. Nigerian authorities say they have not reported any new Omicron cases. This was since announcing on December 1st that they had detected 3 cases in travelers from South Africa. Information Minister Lai Mohammed said Monday that the British travel ban is not driven by science. Italy is bringing in new restrictions for non-vaccinated people ahead of the holiday season. It is excluding them from indoor restaurants, theaters, and museums into the new year. This to control the spread of coronavirus and encourage vaccine skeptics to get their shots. Starting Monday through January 15th, Italian police can check whether diners seated in restaurants or bars have a super health pass, certifying that they are either vaccinated or have recovered from the virus. Those who used to rely on just a recent negative test are not allowed in. The number of new infections in Italy has been rising for the past 6 weeks. Myanmar's Aung San Suu Kyi has been sentenced to 4 years in prison after being found guilty of incitement and violating coronavirus restrictions. The civilian leader was ousted in a de facto coup earlier this year. Her trial has been widely criticized as a further attempt by the country's military rulers to roll back the democratic gains of recent years. Today's verdict is expected to be just the first in a series of cases against the 76-year-old. If found guilty of all charges, Ms. Suu Kyi could spend the rest of her life in prison. Dozens of Japanese tanks are participating in a major exercise on the northern island of Hokkaido. The move is a display of military power that coincides with a recent escalation of Chinese and Russian military moves around Japanese territory. Japan has so far focused on its defensive capabilities and carefully avoids using the word military for its troops. Among Japan's biggest worries is China's increased naval activity. This includes an aircraft carrier that's been repeatedly spotted off Japan's southern coasts. Researchers at the Cleveland Clinic have found that American adults have had an increase in blood pressure during the pandemic, with women showing higher increases than men. The study analyzed blood pressure data of more than 464,000 adults from 50 states between 2018 and 2020. The authors say increased alcohol consumption, less physical activity, emotional stress, and less ongoing medical care may all be contributing factors to increased blood pressures during the pandemic. A kilt-wearing Scotsman and his dog completed an 8,000-kilometer fundraising walk across Canada yesterday when they arrived at Cape Spear in eastern Newfoundland. Michael Yellowlees and his Alaskan Husky Luna started their journey in Tofino, BC 9 months ago. Mr. Yellowlees undertook the epic trek to raise money for a conservation group trying to revitalize the Caledonian forest. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. For more news on demand, please visit our website, thenewsforum.ca. Take care, Canada. We'll see you next time.